In the ancient Yoruba city of Ìrònú, whose walls were carved from salt and sun-dried wisdom, they tell the story of a king who tried to silence the wind. His name is no longer spoken in formal gatherings, but the wise elders call him Oba Àfọ, the king who closed his hand around nothing. When children ask about him, grandmothers lower their voices to the soft murmur of distant thunder, and their eyes drift toward the eastern hills where his palace once stood. The old ones say that before recounting this tale, one must scatter 7 grains of salt over the left shoulder, not to ward off evil, but to remind ourselves that even the purest substance can burn an open wound. For this is not merely a story of madness, but a remembrance of what happens when power forgets to listen. Oba Àfọ was born under a sky split by lightning, his cry louder than the thunder that followed. The midwives claimed his umbilical cord was wrapped thrice around his neck, yet he emerged unharmed, gasping not in distress, but in what seemed like indignation. His mother, Queen Idunni, bled for 7 days afterward but refused to die, whispering to her newborn, "You will be great, but greatness is a burden that crushes those who carry it alone." A seer named Baba Fagbamila visited on the 3rd day of the child's life. White-haired and bent like a question mark, he performed the divination ritual with trembling hands. As the 16 sacred palm nuts scattered across the mat, the old man's eyes widened. He leaned close to the Queen Mother and whispered words that would haunt the kingdom for generations. "This child will command the elements, but not himself." The Queen clutched her infant tighter and replied, "Then I shall teach him to command his heart first." But fate, that weaver of impossible patterns, had other designs. Years passed like migrating birds, each season adding new feathers to the young prince's wings. He learned to hunt with his father, King Adagok the Just, whose arrows were said to seek only the flesh of beasts that had lived full lives. He studied the ancient texts with scholars whose beards reached their knees, absorbing histories of kingdoms risen and fallen. He sat with the common folk during festivals, learning their songs and stories, seemingly at home among both royalty and peasantry. The people whispered that the prince had been blessed by Orunmila himself, the divinity of wisdom. For despite his youth, his judgments showed remarkable clarity. When 2 farmers disputed over damaged crops, young Àfọ suggested they exchange fields for a season, so each might tend what he once claimed was ruined, and harvest what he once claimed was worthless. Both men left satisfied. When he was 17, during the festival of New Yams, King Adagok summoned the royal diviners for guidance on a drought that had begun to threaten the kingdom. As was custom, the king took the first bite of the sacred kola nut before the divination could begin. The nut, bitter yet sweet like truth itself, lodged in his throat. The court watched in horror as their king gasped, his eyes bulging. 3 healers rushed forward, but the king's spirit had already begun its journey to the realm of ancestors. Some say it was cruel happenstance. Others say the gods gagged him to prevent a warning about his son's future reign from passing his lips. Prince Àfọ became king before sunset, his father's body still warm when the crown of cowries and gold was placed upon his head. At first, Àfọ ruled with the wisdom all had expected. He listened intently to the council of elders, whose combined years numbered more than the stars visible on the clearest night. He appointed ministers based on merit rather than lineage. He fasted with the poor during times of scarcity, declaring, "A king's stomach should never be fuller than his people's hope." He slept beneath the same moon as his subjects, often refusing the comfort of the royal chambers to spend nights under the open sky, to better hear the whispers of the ancestors, he explained. The kingdom flourished. Rain returned. Markets bustled. Children were born with laughter already in their lungs. But then the dreams came. It began on the night of his 25th birthday. The king woke before dawn, drenched in sweat despite the cool air. The royal drummers found him standing in the courtyard, staring at the fading stars. "I dreamed a voice," he told his closest advisor, an elder named Ogundil, a voice that spoke not in words, but in the spaces between words. Ogundil, wise in the ways of dreams, suggested a cleansing ritual. "Dreams are messengers," he said, "but not all messengers speak truth." The king nodded, but did not heed the counsel. That night, he ordered his sleeping mat moved to the highest point of the palace, where the wind was strongest. "To clear my head," he claimed. But the courtiers who served him noticed how he tilted his ear toward the gusts, as if listening for something or someone riding within them. 3 moons passed. The king grew distant. His judgments, once balanced like perfectly cast divination shells, became erratic. He sentenced a thief to forgiveness one day and ordered a debtor's hands cut off the next. He began to talk to someone no one else could see, a tall, shadowy figure draped in cowries and feathers, who seemed to stand just behind the throne, visible only to the king's increasingly bloodshot eyes. The king called this presence Imo, the unknown. "He shows me truth," the king explained to his concerned council. "Not this noise the world calls wisdom. Your words are pebbles, his are mountains." The elders exchanged worried glances. The chief diviner requested permission to consult the Ifa oracle regarding the king's health. Afo laughed, a sound like pottery breaking. "The Ifa speaks in riddles because it fears directness," he declared. "Imo speaks directly because he fears nothing." He stopped calling on the Ifa. He called instead on mirrors, 13 of them, arranged in a circle in his private chamber, so he could always see himself from every angle. "To ensure no aspect of truth escapes me," he explained to his increasingly troubled advisors. The palace craftsmen were ordered to create these mirrors from polished silver, framed with the wood of the Irako tree, sacred to the ancestors. Each was blessed with the blood of a different animal: leopard for strength, tortoise for wisdom, eagle for vision, and others whose symbolism only the king seemed to understand. Markets still opened at dawn, but traders spoke in whispers. Children still played, but their games changed, no longer imitating hunters or heroes, but the king speaking to his invisible companion. One morning, without warning or counsel, the king ordered the sacred drum of the town, Aya Ilu, mother of drums, whose rhythms had called the first settlers to this land generations ago, to be brought before him. The drum keeper, an old woman named Aduni, who had served 3 kings before Afowa, carried it with trembling arms. The drum was older than any living person, its wood darkened by countless hands, its skin stretched tight from centuries of speaking to both gods and mortals. "This," the king said, pointing accusingly at the drum, "is the source of confusion. It speaks when only I should speak." With a nod to his guard, a sword flashed. The sacred drum, the voice of the community, the keeper of rhythms that connected the living to their ancestors, was split in 2. Aduni fell to her knees, not from grief, but from shock. "My king," she whispered, "what have you done?" "If the gods have mouths," he replied coldly, "let them speak without rhythm." That night, a council met in secret, elders, priests, and trusted commoners gathering in the sacred grove outside the city walls. They debated until dawn whether the king was ill or possessed. His father showed no signs of madness, argued the chief hunter, Ojo. And madness doesn't arrive like a sudden storm. "Perhaps it's grief," suggested Funmaleo, the medicine woman. "The crown is heavy, and he wore it young." "It's neither," said Baba Fagbamila, the same seer who had prophesied at the king's birth. Now ancient, His voice was barely audible above the night insect song. It is hunger, a hunger of the spirit that feeds on itself until nothing remains but appetite. They might have continued debating until the next dawn, but a boy burst into the clearing, breathless. "The king has decreed," he gasped. "No gatherings larger than 13. The royal guard searches house to house." They scattered like birds before a wildfire. The king's decree, officially recorded as Proclamation 17, stated precisely, "The people may no longer gather in numbers greater than the king's shadows." The scribes confirmed. There were 13 mirrors in the king's chamber, creating 13 reflections. The kingdom, once filled with the laughter of markets and the singing of dawn greetings, went quiet. Weddings were postponed. Funerals became hasty affairs. The wind itself seemed to tiptoe through the streets of Ìrònú. But the king's transformation had only begun. He dismissed his advisers, replacing them with sycophants who praised his every pronouncement. He doubled the palace guard, recruiting not from families of warriors with generational codes of honor, but from restless young men with grudges and ambition. These new soldiers, wearing red sashes across their chests to mark their allegiance directly to Àfọ rather than to the crown, enforced his increasingly erratic decrees. No red cloth may be worn by commoners. Red had been the favored color of his father. No stories may be told that feature speaking animals. The king claimed such tales mocked divine order. The word for wind must not be spoken aloud. This last decree came after a night of particularly strong gales that kept the king awake, pacing and arguing with his invisible companion. Even his appearance changed. He abandoned the traditional royal attire for robes of his own design, black fabric embroidered with eyes of silver thread. He shaved his head, but grew his fingernails long, painting them with charcoal mixed with his own blood. To better grasp what slips through ordinary fingers, he explained to no one in particular. Yet for all his apparent madness, his soldiers, fiercely loyal due to generous payment and the intoxication of unchecked power, echoed and amplified his delusions. "The king sees what we cannot," they told frightened villagers. "His wisdom extends beyond the visible world." Some believed this. Many did not. But fear kept assent to whispers behind closed doors, until one woman decided that even whispers were too quiet. Her name was Aurora, a blind drummer whose music once summoned rain during the kingdom's worst drought. Age had bent her spine until she stood no taller than a child, but her hands remained strong, her fingers nimble as they had been in youth. Having lost her sight in childhood to smallpox, she claimed the disease had taken her eyes but given her ears that could hear tomorrow's footsteps. For 60 years, she had played at every significant ceremony in Ìrònú: births, marriages, funerals, coronations. She had played when Àfọ's father was crowned. She had played at Àfọ's own naming ceremony. Now she lived alone on the outskirts of town, largely forgotten except by the few who sought her wisdom or her music in defiance of the king's decrees. When news reached her about the destruction of the sacred drum, Aurora sat motionless for 3 days, neither eating nor drinking. On the 4th day she rose, bathed in water collected from the morning dew, and dressed in her ceremonial indigo-dyed cloth, the color of deep wisdom. She reached beneath her sleeping mat and withdrew a small drum, no larger than a child's head. Unlike the elaborate carvings on ceremonial drums, this one was plain, its surface smooth from decades of handling. It had been her first drum, given to her by her teacher when she was just 7 years old. "This drum has never spoken to power," she whispered to it. "Today it will." She walked barefoot toward the palace, tapping a gentle rhythm on the drum slung across her back. Those who saw her emerge from the morning mist crossed to the other side of the road, fearful of association with such open defiance. At the palace gates, for guards blocked her path, their spears crossed. "Old woman," the captain said not unkindly, "return home. The king sees no petitioners today." Aurora smiled, revealing gaps where teeth had long ago surrendered to time. "I have not come to petition," she replied. "I have come to remind." She tapped the drum once. The sound it produced was impossible, too deep, too resonant for its small size. It echoed not outward, but inward, causing the guards to shudder, as if the vibration had reached something buried within their bones. The drum began to play on its own, the drumhead pulsing as if touched by invisible fingers. The guards' training told them to strike her down. Their ancestral memory told them to step aside. Memory won. She walked straight through the palace corridors, guided not by sight, but by the echo of her footsteps against the walls. Courtiers flattened themselves against walls as she passed, both fearful and awestruck. In the throne room, Oba Àfo sat surrounded by his 13 mirrors, each positioned to catch the morning light. He wore his crown tilted forward, almost covering his eyes, as if the weight of it had become too much for his neck to bear upright. He was mid-conversation with the empty space behind his throne when Aurora entered. "Cannot be contained by their rituals," he was saying to the air. "We must go further, perhaps their tongues." He stopped when the blind drummer approached and bowed low, her forehead touching the polished floor in the traditional prostration before royalty. "Who disturbs me?" he demanded, voice cracking like a whip. "One who knew you before you knew yourself, Kabiyesi," she answered, using the honorific that meant Your Highness, but literally translated to "We dare not question you." Recognition flickered across his face. "The drummer," he said. "Aurora of Ìrònú." "The same. You break 2 of my decrees by coming here, carrying a drum and approaching without summons. Speak quickly before I add a 3rd offense, breathing without permission." She rose slowly, her aged joints protesting, but her spine straightened with dignity despite its curve. "Baba," she said softly, using the familiar term for father rather than his title, a remarkable intimacy that caused gasps among the attending courtiers. "You have forgotten the difference between being filled with spirit and being swollen with self." The king's eyes narrowed. Behind him, though only he could see it, the shadow figure Ima rippled like disturbed water. "Summons." "Speak again," the king said, voice trembling with barely controlled rage, "and I will unmake you." "Then unmake me," Aurora replied, her blind eyes somehow finding his across the space between them. "But know this, even madness listens eventually, because silence is loud when it's alone." Before the king could respond, she played. The rhythm had no beginning. It was the sound of memory before language. It was the heartbeat of an unborn child hearing its mother's song. It was the sound of a baby's cry before its first breath. It was the footsteps of ancestors crossing the star bridge. It was the sound of the ancestors holding their breath. It was truth, undressed and unafraid. And the mirrors shattered, one by one, not violently, not explosively, but gently, like ice giving way to spring's first warm day. Cracks appeared, spreading like rivers, finding their paths to the sea, until each mirror collapsed into harmless shards that caught the light and scattered it across the floor in patterns resembling ancient script. The king's face contorted with horror. He grabbed at the air behind him, at the shadow only he could see, as if trying to prevent it from escaping. "Stay," he commanded. "I need you. I am nothing without you." Behind him, the shadow Ima laughed, a sound like dried leaves scuttling across stone. And then, rather than fleeing, it did something worse. It turned toward the king and stepped forward, entering his body fully, taking over what little was left of his mind. The king's body convulsed. When his eyes opened again, they were entirely black, like pools of midnight. He rose wild-eyed and shouted in a voice too large for his throat, "I am the only voice." The words struck the walls like physical blows, cracking ancient stonework, causing dust to rain from the ceiling beams. And then the wind answered. It began as a whisper, a mere stirring of the tapestries hanging in the throne room. But it grew, finding every crack and crevice in the palace walls, until the entire structure hummed like a massive flute. Aurora continued playing, her fingers moving independently of her will now, channeling rhythms older than the kingdom itself. The wind spoke with 1,000 voices at once, a chorus of the forgotten and silenced. We are still here. Outside the palace walls, a storm descended on Ìrònú. The sky darkened at midday, not with rain clouds, but with something else, a darkness that moved with purpose, swirling and gathering like flocks of birds wheeling in complex patterns. The townspeople emerged from their homes despite the prohibition against gathering. Some force greater than fear drew them into the streets, where they stood with faces upturned toward the churning sky. It was not rain that fell upon them. It was ancestral wind, gusts that carried scents from childhood, sounds from celebrations long past, whispers of names nearly forgotten. Each gust was a memory. The farmer's daughter the king had banished for accidentally spilling water on his robes, the diviner he had humiliated for predicting drought, the boy who had starved because yam taxes had tripled to pay for the king's mirrors. The royal guard stood uncertain, weapons ready, but unsure what to defend against. The wind carried no spears, raised no fists. It simply remembered. In the confusion, something remarkable happened. A young girl, perhaps 7 years old, began to tap a rhythm on an overturned pot. Her mother reached to stop her, fearful of punishment, but then hesitated. Instead, she found a gourd and joined her daughter's rhythm. An old man produced a small hand drum from beneath his robes, where he had hidden it since the king's decree. He added his voice to the growing conversation of beats. The sound spread like fire across dry grass. People gathered, not with weapons, but with drums. Whatever could be struck to produce rhythm, pots, gourds, sticks against hollow logs, hands against thighs, became instruments in an impromptu orchestra that grew with each passing moment. Hundreds of them, young and old, priest and outcast, playing one rhythm that seemed to rise from the earth itself rather than from any human design. Those who knew the words began to sing, "Ima kiidail, agbra ijo and inko orarun." The unknown cannot build a home, only unity finds a source. The rhythm spread beyond human participants. Trees swayed in time. Birds called in syncopation. Even the stones of the city walls seemed to vibrate at a complementary frequency. The wind gathered this unified expression and carried it toward the palace, not as a weapon, but as a reminder. Inside the throne room, the king, or what had once been the king, fought against Aurora's music and the responding wind. His body twisted unnaturally as the entity Ima tried to maintain control. "They are nothing," he screamed in that too large voice. "Insects, dust. I have seen beyond the veil. I alone know truth." But the wind struck the palace like a gourd hitting stone, not to destroy, but to awaken. Windows shattered inward. Doors tore from hinges. The very air became thick with presence. The cacophony of wind, music, and voices, human and otherwise, built to an unbearable crescendo. Then silence. In that moment of perfect stillness, Oba Àfọ stepped outside his palace doors. He walked not with the arrogance of recent months, but with the uncertain steps of one recovering from long illness. His eyes, Clear now shadow scanned the gathered crowd, his people, whom he had forgotten in his obsession with power. The shadow peeled from his skin like old cloth, rising into the air above him, twisting in agony as it found itself exposed to the combined will of the community. It turned to smoke and vanished into the wind with a sound like a distant scream. The king stood naked in spirit if not in body, stripped of both madness and the protection it had offered from truth. He fell to his knees and wept, not from pain, but recognition. "I forgot," he said, his voice barely audible to those nearest him. "I forgot that a king is not above, but within." The crowd waited, breath held collectively, for what would come next. Some called for his death, others for mercy. The debate might have turned violent if not for the intervention of the blind drummer. Aurora approached the kneeling king, her ancient hand finding his shoulder with unerring accuracy. "To rule others," she said, her voice carrying despite its softness, "one must first listen to something beyond oneself." She placed her small drum in his hands. "Begin again," she said, but this time with open hands rather than closed fists. Oba Àfo never ruled again. He surrendered his crown in a ceremony attended by all of Ìrònú. As tradition demanded, he recited his royal lineage back 7 generations, acknowledging the weight of his failure not just to himself but to his ancestors. Then he did something unprecedented. He recited the names of those he had wronged during his reign. It took from sunrise to sunset. He became a silent drummer, living among the people in a small hut he built with his own hands on the outskirts of the city. For a year, he spoke to no one, communicating only through the rhythms he played on Aurora's drum. The old woman became his teacher, instructing his fingers to speak what his mouth had forgotten how to say. Children feared him at first, but curiosity eventually overcame their apprehension. They would gather at a safe distance while he played, gradually moving closer as they recognized in his music the same stories their grandparents told around evening fires. Eventually, they brought him questions instead of suspicion. "Why did the spirit choose you?" a particularly bold child once asked. After long consideration, he answered, "It did not choose me. I chose it. Each time I silenced a voice that disrupted my own. Each time I mistook fear for wisdom. Each time I favored being right over being kind." The throne was left empty for a full year out of respect for the traditional mourning period, though whether they mourned the king's madness or the community's compliance remained unspoken. During this year, the kingdom was ruled by Opolopo, the Council of Many, a rotating seat of elders, children, merchants, farmers, and even strangers passing through. Decisions required not majority rule, but deep listening until consensus emerged naturally, like water finding its level. Some expected chaos. Instead, they discovered something remarkable. When many minds approach a problem from different directions, solutions emerge that no single perspective could envision. When the year ended, the people decided not to crown a new king. The Council of Many became permanent, though its membership continued to rotate like the seasons. Each year since then, they hold the Festival of the Broken Mirrors, where 13 clay discs are shattered at dawn. The fragments are collected and used to create mosaics depicting scenes from their shared history, beauty from brokenness, wisdom from fracture. During this festival, even the former king joins the celebration, now an elder white-haired drummer whose rhythms help younger generations remember. No kings are crowned. No drums are silenced. No voices dismissed as irrelevant. Only one thing is said as the festival concludes and the community gathers to watch the sunset together. Even the wind bends when many voices blow as one. And in response, a breeze always stirs, gentle as a grandmother's caress, playful as a child's laughter, carrying the scent of both remembrance and possibility. For the people of Ìrònú have learned what many kingdoms never discover. True power lies not in controlling the wind, but in learning to listen to its song. Thank you for watching. Don't forget to comment, like, subscribe, and share.